Hello and welcome to Africa Today. I am Mike Okwache. Libya is believed to be on the verge of a more chaotic phase since the revolution that overthrew the long regime of Muammar Gaddafi nearly 3 years ago. In a similar scenario where the army proved to be the supreme political force in neighboring Egypt, various factions of militant groups are in a battle for power and oil wealth in post-Gaddafi Libya. There are now fears of an impending humanitarian and environmental disaster following a fire at an oil depot in Tripoli, which raged out of control after a storage tank was hit in a militia crossfire. Now, what are your thoughts on the crisis in Libya? You can share with us on Twitter at TVC Africa Today or send an email to africatoday@tvcnews.tv. We'll take a report and Africa Today will continue. Thanks for joining us.
Fuel tanks in Libya's capital, Tripoli, continued to burn after being struck by rocket fire a few days ago. The fuel tanks, situated near Tripoli International Airport, hold 6 million liters of gasoline. It was struck on Monday in the crossfire of warring militias, battling for control of the airfield, the latest violence to plague the country. Firefighters are struggling to contain the blaze and have asked residents within a 5-kilometer radius of the tanks to evacuate for fear of the tanks exploding. Libya's interim government said in a statement that the fire could trigger a humanitarian and environmental disaster in Tripoli and appealed for international help to extinguish the inferno. The blaze has spread to a second depot and it is unclear if there were any injuries from the fire. Damage from the shelling could also be seen on buildings close to the Albrika fuel storage tanks. The government says in the 2 weeks of fighting in the capital Tripoli and the city of Benghazi, more than 150 people have died, many of them civilians, as clashes forced US and foreign diplomats to pull out of the country. Amina Hamid, Africa Today.
All right, thanks for joining us. The last few months have been a case of rockets, warplanes, fire and bloodshed in Libya. The struggle for control of Tripoli's airport, which began 2 weeks ago, has left so much damage, with a mass of thick smoke billowing over the city's skyline to show for it. Now, joining us to look at the issues in Africa Today, we have Tunji Ladner, a media consultant and political analyst. You're welcome to Africa Today.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here.
All right, and we also have via Skype Hugh Miles, a journalist and director of Al Shafi Miles Consultancy. He'll be joining us from Libya as well. All right, yeah, Hugh Miles, welcome to Africa Today. Now, the crisis in Libya, at this time, a few years ago, or maybe a year or two ago, Africans, those within and outside Libya or within the continent, were thinking that Libya should have been a stable country by now. But it has been one crisis after another, even after elections, as the case may be. How did Libya get to this level?
Well, you have to use the term elections very guardedly in Gaddafi's regime. I think really we should actually go beyond just the immediate cycle of history and take a quick journey into Libya of antiquity. Right. Libya has always been unstable. Right, it was conquered respectively by the Greeks, the Romans. These were Berbers, right? The Greeks, Romans, you fast forward, the Ottoman Empire, that's when Islam came on. And thereafter battles with Western forces and Western, as a matter of fact, I think Libya actually went to war with America in the 1800s, yes. So there's just been a long historical cycle of unrest. So this is the latest iteration in my own estimation, and it's perhaps the consequence of that coup in September 1st, 1969, when you overthrew, I think, King Idris, Gaddafi, 27-year-old soldier. And so it's a sense in which you actually have to have a longer view of Libya, right? There was some kind of a stability for the 2 years of the Gaddafi
rule.
But it was, you know, the quietude of the graveyard, as they say. And the moment you remove the strongman, everything unravels. And so that's where we are now. I mean, it's really the past as prologue. It's been clear that it's been unstable. It was just the imperium of the strongman, the proverbial African strongman that kept it. So Libya is not really unusual for Africa. It's typical for Africa.
But we saw that unity in fighting to oust Muammar Gaddafi. All the different factions coming together, having one enemy, so to say. Let's get off Gaddafi as the key. And all of them were thinking, okay, we're looking forward to a progressive and more prosperous Libya. But after Gaddafi is gone, everything is falling apart.
Well, Gaddafi was the singular unifying force. There was a central enemy for everybody else. So my enemy's enemy is my enemy, my friend's enemy is my... So there's a whole web of intentions there. But the key thing you have to understand was that everybody is united against Gaddafi, because after 45 years from 1969, right, it was just time, right? But the question you have to ask yourself now is, after him next, what next? And this is the what next question. The other thing you also have to put into perspective is that if you've been under the imperium and the dictatorial governance, I use the word governance guardedly, the rulership of a person who was, towards the end of his regime, beginning to look as if he was slightly unhinged, if you ask any right-thinking person, right? You did not build the institutions for democracy. Everything was centralized, everything was free.
Around him.
So the question now is, okay, now you have this freedom, what do you do with it? The system itself, the body politic itself was not mature enough, was not prepared. So when you have no antecedent of governance, democratic governance, building civil society, you know, the instruments of the state, you know, rule of law, all of those things were centralized around the persona of one individual. And so you have a conditioned response to that. You take that person out and it's chaos, because the people who are supposed to inherit this have no idea what to do.
Okay, we'll come back to this. Now, Hugh Miles is joining us now. He's the director of Al Shafi Miles Consultancy from Egypt. Hugh Miles, you're welcome to Africa Today. Now, Egypt seemed to be a little bit stable comparative to Libya. What is your assessment in a North African nation generally?
Well, I didn't hear the last part of your question exactly, but Egypt is more stable than Libya because Egypt has an army, a strong army, and this is the one institution in the country that has stopped Egypt falling apart. But Libya was all the institutions, including the army, were destroyed by Gaddafi because he saw them as a threat. So it's no central authority. So now you have all these warring militias run essentially by warlords that are fighting for very base reasons, not for ideological reasons, not because they're Sunni and Shia, but simply for oil wealth and for power and territory. So it's a very sad state of affairs.
All right, now with the trend of things, so some are blaming the international community for some of the crisis going on in Libya. What's your assessment from that perspective?
Well, I don't think that the international community is really to blame. My feeling is that the Libyans had a chance and they blew it, or they've nearly blown it. It's not over yet. Libya is not a failed state yet. It is not seen killing on the scale of Iraq or Syria. There is still hope. There is still a political route out of this problem that they're facing at the moment. But unfortunately, the politics is moving too slowly and the violence is spreading. So it seems that the country is in a very desperate state. But I don't think foreign powers are to blame for this. And I think that foreign powers can do something to help by trying to mediate between these warlords and these militias. I don't think there's a role for any foreign soldiers, of course, and it's very difficult intervening in Libya. This is an extremely sensitive issue that is contested between the different parties, particularly the Islamists are very much against any kind of foreign interference in Libyan affairs. But I think that there is the possibility of a mediator, but he or she would have to be endorsed by the United Nations and also, I think, by the Arab League.
All right, now, why is it difficult to galvanize these warring factions or the militias from different regions? Why is it difficult to galvanize them together towards a prosperous or united Libya?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the question.
All right, I'm asking that it has become very difficult to bring all these warring militia factions together to negotiate on the same table towards the unity and progress of Libya. Why is that?
Yes, I think I can hear you. Yes, I mean, this is a disaster for Libya. It set the clocks back a long way. The economic damage is colossal. The burning of the airport is going to mean that it's not easy for outsiders to access the country, and Libya depends on foreign help and aid workers and foreigners to a great extent. Journalists, diplomats are all going to have problems accessing the country. So it's a very difficult job bringing these warring factions together. But this is what must be done, and there is a resolution mechanism in Libya. So far, the different coalition groups, the warring parties in Libya, have not so far gone at each other in a full war. They have held back from full confrontation because of the intervention of tribal elders and traditional dispute resolution mechanisms. So it's possible that there could be a resolution here, but I think it's looking increasingly unlikely.
All right. Thank you. We'll come back to you again, Hugh Miles. Now, as it is, we have not seen very deliberate effort to mediate between the factions in Libya by the Arab League or the African Union. Why is that?
Well, you know, part of it is like what Hugh was talking about, the fact that you have this fractionalized set of interests that are pursuing their respective wars for their own base interests. So what is at stake here is really money, money, territory, power, and all of that, okay? So there are two ways you can say, you know, the mediation mechanism has to be put in place, and that can be done, like he was suggesting, through the United Nations, right? I doubt if the Arab League itself would directly interfere, because you also realize that under Gaddafi, you know, Libya was a pariah, even amongst the Arab League itself. And also the fact that even the AU itself has limited resources. I mean, save for the grand theatrics of Gaddafi in 2006 when he was declared the King of Kings in Africa, you know, the whole thing about the AU, we always assume that they actually have the ability to intervene directly. Yes, they might be part of some kind of a coalition of interests through the UN, to the mechanism of the Security Council, perhaps under the aegis of the Big Five, right? And that now draws them together into another attempt at mediating between these forces. Hugh also mentioned the fact that they haven't gone full tilt in a war, right? But it's pretty close to that
it's
now.
Close to that. It's close to civil war.
It is a civil war by any other means. I just now listening into the news, another top Libyan official was kidnapped, right? So it's really chaos and chaotic scenarios. And the one thing I'd like to say is, you know, I'm not quite sure about the definition of a failed state. Okay. Perhaps not a failed state, as you might say, but definitely there's a whole theory about what is called limited statehood. When you cease to have control over the territorial integrity of your country, that means that, you know, it's a limited state. And you can hemorrhage like that for a long time.
All right.
You can have this emergence of what might be described as shogunates. It might be like Imperial Japan, where you had the shoguns and you had warlords,
exactly,
you know, controlling certain parts of the country. It's a very small country. I mean, it's less than, what, 6.5 million people? But there's a lot of oil, and those are the interests.
Okay, we'll come back to this. In the last 2 weeks, the brigades of former anti-Gaddafi rebels, mainly from the towns of Zintan and Misrata, have turned the south of the Libyan capital into a battlefield. But for how long will this continue in Libya? We'll go on a quick break, and Africa Today will continue. Stay with us. All right, the ongoing crisis in Libya has got us talking on Africa Today, and Tunji Ladner and Hugh Miles have been my guests on the show. We have Hugh Miles online still joining us via Skype. Hugh, let me ask you, what do you make of countries pulling out their diplomats from Libya? What's the implication of that now?
Well, it's another sign that Libya is turning into a failed state. This is obviously a very ominous sign. The withdrawal of all these diplomats is showing that the country is becoming isolated from the outside world, and it's going to become more isolated. Now the airport has been destroyed, It's just another benchmark, if you like, of how the country is deteriorating.
All right. Talking about General Khalifa Haftar, so many analysts say that he's kind of al-Sisi in the waiting or in the making, as the case may be. What's your analysis from that point of view? He's becoming a strong man.
I think that General Khalifa Haftar sees himself as Sisi, but Libya is not Egypt. The situation is very different. In Egypt, the army has a monopoly on power, more or less. In Libya, that is not the case. You have many different groups, and General Khalifa Haftar is really just another warlord, commander. Although he's appointed himself as the national army, he's not recognized as that. So there's really little difference between him and a number of other similar characters. So the idea that he's going to pacify Libya the way that General Sisi has pacified Egypt is simply not the case. Everyone in Libya has a gun to everybody else's head. They have the power to tear themselves apart. They are very well armed, and there's nothing to stop them fighting very brutal war. But they need just diplomacy and negotiation, not force, to sort out problems. And I'm hopeful, I should add. I was thinking this oil fire might present an opportunity for the international community to make an offer to Libya, a suggestion of how they could come together to tackle the blaze. This is the kind of thing that Libyans need. I mean, the Libyans need so much outside help, but this would be one way maybe I'm dreaming, but this would be a good way to start the ball rolling, to try and bring the community, the international community in, bring the Libyan factions together to deal with this national emergency.
All right, thank you very much, Humas, for your time on Africa Today. Thank you.
Countries.
Thank you for joining us, Humas. All right, he was just talking about General Khalifa Haftar. What do you think is his interest in all of this? Because he seemed to be fueling a part of the crisis, calling for an armed struggle, or maybe if you call an antagonism against Ansar al-Sharia.
Yeah, well, General Haftar's is, as Hugh was saying, a self-styled Sisi. And again, you have to listen to what the other gentleman was saying. It's not an easy, ready parallel between Egypt and Libya. In Egypt, you've had the deep state, which was created under Nasser in the 50s when they had the first military coup. And so they are the dominant power, and they do have the military might to force order if need be, as we can see in the way they very brutally address the issue of the Muslim Brotherhood. Yeah, Muslim Brotherhood. You don't have that kind of power instituted in the state. You see, the difference in Egypt and Libya is that power is diffused within an organization, within an authority, the army itself. So it does have its control and command structures in place, right, as an army. And I think it actually is the largest army on the continent. And they have a lot of weapons from the Americans and historically from the Russians. So it is the dominant political force in Egypt. You don't have that in Libya, because everything was personalized. Because to perpetuate his reign, he virtually destroyed all of those state institutions because it was all about him and his little green book. And so there's that. It's apples and oranges basically. And the reason why General Haftar has not been able to impose an imperium is because he can't. He doesn't have.
He doesn't have what it takes.
It's him and which army? I mean, so it's just another of half a dozen factions struggling for access to territory. I think what's eventually going to happen, and I think that's a good thing that Hugh said, this blazing oil fire might just be an opportunity for people to just sheath their swords and say, okay, let's come to the compromise and deal with this problem first. In the meantime, it might also form the basis for new conversations as to how this thing is going to proceed, right? Because the National Army itself, all the key militia groups have refused to be part of the National Army, and these places are awash with weapons. And and part of that, the aftermath of the end of the revolution is the fact that the controlling agency, the controlling mechanism for keeping those arms in place, have all but vanished.
Exactly.
So you now have the entire Maghreb ablaze and awash with Libyan
with all the
arms,
weapons
up until even right down through Chad to our own situation here in Nigeria. Via
even
Boko
to
Haram.
Mali and so
Mali,
on, Central
yes.
African Republic.
Algeria, the raid 2 years ago on the Algerian oil and gas thing, it's all weaponry from Libya. And, you know, analysts have also said that those weapons have trickled down south from their own perspective geographically, down to the north of our own country, and it's helping to arm and fuel Boko Haram. So it's really the unraveling of the state and that had so much money and so many weapons.
All right. Now, what would it take to bring this militias to one table to negotiate?
The only thing that I think, and I think is a great suggestion, is, you know, they now have a common enemy in the fire because it's a huge oil blaze. It's
very huge.
It's going to attack the very basis, the jewel in the crown for what they're fighting for.
Exactly.
Right. And so it might be, I think there's been a temporary ceasefire, as a matter of fact, to allow the Italians to come in to help. Okay, but the Italian connection also is also historical. Right. It was not until 1947 that they were independent of Italy and went under joint British and French administration under the Allies. So there's a whole history there. The Italians were there, you know. So maybe this might be, you know, one of those God-sent opportunities to say, okay, you know, we have a bigger enemy now, which is fire, literally, that's going to burn up the entire. So before we start killing each other, let us douse this fire first. And it might just be an opportunity for the UN itself, acting in concert with the AU and the Arab League, to now come in under the guise of wanting to help put out the fire and, you know, rebuild the oil infrastructure, to say, okay, let us sit down and come and talk about this. But, you know, unfortunately, the genie is out of the bottle. I mean, the aftermath of Libya post-Gaddafi is what we are experiencing here in terms of weapons. And by the way, during Gaddafi's time also, he was also a major destabilizing factor in the whole of Africa. He fueled and funded people as far as Idi Amin in Uganda, Charles Taylor in Liberia. So it was, you know, he was the favorite for any terrorist, any insurrection group in Africa. A lot of the people that worked, you know, for Taylor in Liberia, also in Sierra Leone, Foday Sankoh was also, so he's really has not been a force for good, Gaddafi himself. And, you know, and towards the end of his life, it was clear that he had lost his marbles. I mean, but the legacy of this is the weapons.
Okay. There has been a craving for democracy, democratic Libya, as the case be. What kind of democracy should, considering the different components of what Libya is and so on, and then the historic factor you talked about, what kind of democracy should?
I think it has to be a two-step thing. You can't, you know, leap from a non-democratic reality to a democratic. There has to be baby steps. So perhaps some kind of a transitional arrangement over a period of time, 5 years, that gives all the warring parties the opportunity to sit down and renegotiate the terms of engagement. So it's almost like the refounding of the country. It's like a new independence for Libya, right? But it will be very difficult for them to make that grand leap into quote-unquote a democratic society without having the democratic traditions and antecedents. It's almost near to impossible because what rules now is the rule of the gun, and they've learned that lesson very well from the erstwhile leader Colonel Gaddafi. So if the world now sees an opportunity in the oil, because the oil thing is beyond the fact that it's just burning, it's also a major environmental issue for the world. I mean, God knows the kind of carbon-related pollution that is emitting. But that might be the opportunity to say, okay, let us tackle these problems collectively as a nation. It might be the one thing that unites all Libyans in the first instance, and through that as a pathway to now having conversations. But it will definitely need, again, Western assistance.
Exactly, because there is no single authority that everyone pledges to, everyone respects. So it would take the international community for that to happen.
Necessarily, it would take, as it did, it took the international community to sway the battle against Gaddafi. So it's a fairly complex, you know. But the other thing is that we now also have to suffer the consequences of that because of the proliferation of arms all across the Maghreb, fueling jihadists, Islamists, militants, and all kinds of other terrorist acts.
It's all right, but from your whole analysis, what do you foresee for Libya in the coming years?
Well, the most cynical thing is that it's going to burn because of the fire. I'm using that metaphorically, almost literally. Right? I think there's a window to say, okay, we've done the post-Gaddafi, no victor, no vanquished. Let us sit down and renegotiate the terms of engagement and drop a new social contract, right? But this will take the direct intervention and leadership of the United Nations and the Security Council, drawing in the Arab League, possibly an AU, and other friendly countries that might want to contribute directly. The fact that the French ambassador and the Italian ambassador have left, everybody is fleeing, is not a very good sign. And you also remember the American experience in Benghazi about 3 years ago.
3 years ago.
So it's really a very complex situation that ironically requires the same international forces that have, over the history of Libya over the last 60 years, shaped Libya. Okay. So there's a certain historical causality here. It's ironic that the same people who caused the problem are now being called
to resolve the problem.
Yes.
It's all right. Tunji Lana, thank you very much for coming on Africa Today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Great.
And we thank you, Miles, for joining us earlier on from Egypt as well. Now, some say it has been 3 unfortunate years for Libya since the fall of Gaddafi, where a weak government have been unable to control armed militias who rule the streets. Although a lack of progress in the North African nation is deeply disappointing, many say the world shouldn't relent in supporting Libya's transition to democracy. But one can only wish for a brighter light at the end of this crisis tunnel for Libya. And that's our show for today. Join us next time for another episode of the program. I am Mike Okwoche, and remember, this is Africa. Bye for now.